Thank you, everyone, for coming to this and the support. Maybe we'll just kind of introduce ourselves briefly. I'm Mike. Got Francesco Siqueiros, Robin Donaldson, and Mr. Wes Jones.
Mr. West Jones.
Mr. Wes Jones. Francesco was the printmaker with El Nepal Press, who did the printmaking for 75% of the work that's in the book. Kevin Giffen of Ranch Studio, who wasn't able to make it, did the screen printing that's in the book. Wes Jones was kind enough to offer some really nice commentary in the form of an essay and also a conversation that Miles fortunately was able to record between us three. And I don't know, I think we're kind of just doing this on the fly. I have a few questions for these guys, and then I think we can kind of just open it from there. Does that sound good?
Does everybody understand how this even came about in the first place?
Why don't we start there?
Like why we're even sitting here?
Let's do that.
Yeah, cool.
And we're sitting here because Mike told us to.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Well-
Yeah. But it started actually even before that. I've got a practice that is, based here in Southern California, and an architectural practice. And we've been practicing for, 25 years or so. And one of the things in our practice that we're starting to push into is some inquiries on the R&D side. So I think it's important that architects push, obviously, in these areas. One of the things we were interested in was drawing and just the nature of drawing. And we're all architects are, probably got wrapped into this profession or kind of pushed into it or sucked into it by the fact that most of us can draw. And if we can't draw, then we're trying to draw. And drawing has changed so much. I started out, I was drawing by hand. Now most of us are using the computer. And Mike and I started having conversations. We started talking because Mike started calling me about, he was working on Tom Main's house, was having some issues and was calling me about it. We started talking. Next thing you know, we're talking about drawing. And pretty soon I sucked Mike into the office in terms of let's start to look at drawing related to some projects we were doing. And was just interested in this inquire around representation versus a referential type of drawing versus a representative drawing. So taking elements of our projects and starting to reconstitute them. So you probably have questions along these lines, but it started out as just sort of an innocent discussion that ended up making a bunch of prints. And then it was, what are we going to do with these prints? And then we did a show. And then when we did the show, better have a book and document it. And then we wanted to talk about it. So that's basically how we ended up here.
Yeah, I guess there weren't really any expectations at the beginning except for just produce some drawings and use some of the work that Shubin Donaldson, some built work.
Yeah.
There's basically within this catalog of the prints, they're based or referential to 3 projects out of the Shubin Donaldson office. One project that was finished how many years ago? The Tremonto.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. One that's currently in construction, and one that just started construction. But I think maybe kind of getting into some of the printmaking and having Francesco, you here, I think maybe you can talk a little bit about how you've, especially the last 10 years, Francesco has kind of worked with architects, producing fine art prints, has worked with a lot of individuals from SciArt, and I think, I don't know, you could probably kind of talk more on that,
Yeah.
if you want.
No, well, I wrote this little text along with David Diamond, another printer friend of mine, and I think it's a little bit what Robin first started talking about. And in the text, I basically go back to an experience I had with Eric Kahn, the late Eric Kahn, and he was teaching at SciArc, and he was sort of walking around with his students, and he came into the shop maybe 2 or 3 times, and he sort of proposed to do a print project with the students. And I think that it was a little bit the whole idea of, you know, sort of like representing drawing in a kind of in a different way other than printing it with a plotter. And I think it started that conversation in there, I think, and later on, you know, Mike came in to do some work for his thesis, and then that led to working with Tom Main, and that's a little bit sort of like the genesis. But I think that the interest for me was that this was this sort of group of architects or architects/artists in asking questions about drawing and representing space with drawings. And I thought that that was, even in the world of the arts, you know, like drawing, especially when it went from learning how to draw, you know, learning how to draw, let's say, the human figure or perspective in the fine art schools, it started going into doing conceptual drawing. And they completely sort of like dropped all these conventions of drawings. And here I was in with these architects/artists, or maybe that's an extension that, you know, is open to discussion, you know, in terms of the vocabulary. But, you know, here I was with architects talking about drawing, you know, in a very passionate way, you know. And going back to drawing by hand or experimenting with different ways of drawing. So that was sort of my personal interest with El Nopal Press, and so that's let me see. I think that project was 2010, so that's, you know, almost 10 years ago since then. Anyway, I mean, there's more to talk about in that space, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think even, I mean, if, and there's a little bit of info on kind of Francesco and Nopal Press. He's using a 1956, 56? Your 2-ton mistress?
Oh, my 3-ton mistress,
3-ton
1958.
So it's a 1958 Mailander German press, and, you know, it's a machine that he keeps running in mint condition. But there is, I think, there's something kind of quite interesting about, you know, drawing that's done through kind of computation, but using the kind of the press in a kind of analog sense to really kind of have a hands-on approach to the work, which I think was, especially I think when it comes to the idea of masking and the title of the book, I think that was something that kind of came on board right away, kind of when you entered the process of the physical making of the prints that were in this book. And I think that kind of physical application that you were able to bring to the table immediately, I think, changed the representation of the work, and I think brought a personalness to it.
Well, I think our tendency was to mess with the normal printmaking process, right?
Yeah,
Because
I remember
we
that,
didn't
yeah.
do a typical edition. The inclination, I don't know if there's an architect's inclination, is to look at the thing as a machine to be messed with, and to put in a piece of paper and block part of, we were interrupting how it normally works, right?
Mhm.
And that was something that occurred out of a way to achieve something that I typically do in my notebooks or I'm drawing and things like that. But using the printer as another kind of device rather than just for reproduction, right?
Well, I think, and I mean, kind of on, I think on that, I mean, one of the questions that I kind of had, or I think a comment in terms of, I think what was quite, I think maybe relevant about the production of the work was kind of, I think Shubin Donaldson kind of taking on a certain kind of attitude of producing kind of work that I think has a strong academic sense, but you're not involved with teaching. But I think kind of taking a project on like this presents a certain attitude, and I think a certain sensibility about how you kind of can practice in the real world. And I think that's important, especially because we do have some students here from SciArc, and I think that the idea of a professional practice taking on a project like this, I think, is quite relevant to the practice of architecture.
Well, I think we're all experimenting with how we practice architecture. And there's a million ways to go, and there's a spectrum from purely academic practices to purely commercial practices. I think most of us, Shubin and Donaldson, really is attempting to find a balance between what we kind of call commerce and art. And I think a lot of architects struggle with that for a whole bunch of different reasons. And in this case, we've reached a point with the practice where some of the things we're going to do probably would land purely in the realm of art, right? You could argue it's not really a building that we produced. Yet I could argue the pieces we made, the drawings we made, there's no way we would have gotten there without the buildings. And I even argue that the pieces we made are as relevant as the buildings. And so it's every architect's prerogative in terms of where they're going to land on that spectrum. But at this stage in our practice, we're pushing more and more to that side of the spectrum, so to speak, in actual pieces as well as that feeding back into the architecture.
Yeah, and I think there's a nice conversation, a transcribed conversation in the book that Wes was a part of, and I think there's a discussion about those objects, whether as art pieces could kind of turn into a piece of architecture. And I think Wes, you made an interesting comment that especially as a practitioner of architecture who produces interesting artwork, but you having the sensibility of the work that you produce, you don't necessarily look at that artwork becoming a piece of architecture, but you look at placing, that's the type of artwork you want to place in your buildings, which is an interesting thing. Maybe you can kind of talk on that.
Right. Well, there is a history, of course, of architects making art, having a sort of parallel or practice that way, and there is the assumption within the profession that the architecture is the primary focus of your creativity, and therefore that the art must be in support of that. The most direct evidence for which is if you can begin to actually see in finished projects the shapes or colors or compositional devices or whatever else that are evident in the paintings. And we can look at history for examples of that, from Michelangelo to Corbu, to see how the art practice could be understood as in support of the architecture practice. And so, like pretty much all architects, and as Michael mentioned, I've always been drawn to drawing and making art and such, and I've always felt a little guilty about it not being in support of the architecture practice in nearly as direct a way, and have had some shows with Eric Kahn, for example, and Gary Page, all three of us architects trying to figure out what that connection might be. And Eric, at the end of his life, had basically decided that, architecture was kind of letting him down, so now he's going to be an artist. And I think that a lot of us would have felt that he was, frankly, an artist all along, which is not to say that he wasn't an architect, but that his principal outlet for creativity, how his mind worked, was much more artistic, and maybe the discipline evident in his art was itself perhaps an effect of his architectural training or whatever, but art was a thing for him. For Gary and I, though, really, we continue to remain architects, and so we struggled to try to figure out how to justify even the time that we spent in the art practice. And at the end of the day, I decided that really, other than things that would be really, really hard to connect, like just not even a compositional sense, just a character in a totally subjective way, that the best way to describe the connection would have been that, in fact, I was making stuff that I thought would be cool on the walls in my building, and just leave it at that and not try to force any greater connection. I have tried, to do more directly, like make a piece of art that was a subject of one of my projects, like you guys did, but it sucked because it was caught halfway between being a rendering, like a presentation drawing and art, and didn't really know which it wanted to be, and so that was not a good thing for me.
Well, but that was something we struggled with from the beginning, because when we first started, the inclination was to do much more representational, but kind of artsy representational.
Right, sure, exactly, yeah.
Right? And at some point, I think really at your encouragement, Mike, we the more we talked about it, the more it became this conversation about referential, not represent, that's where that started.
Right.
But all along, I kind of struggled. I had some guilt. Like, is this really, and I almost felt I had to justify it in some way. And we would go back and forth about this. Like, no, actually, it's referential. We're pulling lines, we're pulling data from the project to make something completely different. And once we kind of got used to that idea, or at least I did, kind of my puritanical sense of, am I wasting time or not? Then that was where we could start to really go. And when we actually ended up in the studio printing, then at that point you don't care anymore. You're not worried about, is this representing anything or not? We're now making something and we're doing it, and we'll see how it turns out. Right?
Well, I think it goes back to, I think, a certain level of like attitude of just taking ownership at the thing at hand, and not necessarily having it, represent. And I mean, because there was early conversations about the work with a kind of partner like Russell, and the idea that the work was able to move kind of past whatever it even intended to represent and could just be appreciated as a piece of art became kind of important enough.
Right.
And I think that
because people were going, wait a minute, that doesn't look like Tremonto, the building, right? It was like, what is this again? So we had those conversations. We had to get through that.
And I think that type of just that attitude or sensibility or confidence to take ownership over the work is a lot. And I mean, I think we've had some, I think interesting conversations, I think recently in regards to that, just the attitude of something. And I've even with, Thomas Linder right here in regards to even, I think your work and in relationship to idea of let's say like surf culture or a certain attitude, and I think that there's something inherent of just the lifestyle in which you kind of make something and just taking ownership over it, that kind of that means a lot. And I think for students that to have the kind of confidence and just take ownership over your ideas means a lot. I think.
Well, that's something you have to take into your practice, right?
Yes.
Right. That's what you're getting at. You're a baseball player, or were.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If you stand at the plate, if you're not confident, and for us, standing at the plate was the moment we were standing in the room with you, Francesco, and you're staring at us. Okay, what do you guys want to do? You're essentially.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah, the clock's ticking.
Well, the thing is that we started printing a project from the get-go. There was really no proofing. We were producing the work, but I do remember that it was the second day where I think the whole thing is sort of took off when you started cutting the strips and blocking, and I think they became the synergy became quite heightened there, but I do think the whole thing was sort of like a sui generis sort of project. It started sort of approaching a little bit sort of like a print, and it's sort of with certain amount of accidentality, you know, because in the proofing, when you're doing proofing, you're making sure everything's printing correctly so you can go back and reproduce it. But in this case, we were just producing the work from the get-go, so there was a kind of like stalling and coming back, and then the ink, I remember it was emulsifying, and so it was, you know, it was quite an experience, you know, I would say.
Well, I think kind of going back to kind of what you were saying, I mean, there's such a, I think, a discipline to the practice of architecture that I think as soon as we kind of allowed the playfulness or to just kind of fuck things up, then immediately I think the project kind of moved forward. And I think that kind of, that relationship of like, of discipline and being disciplined, but at the same time understanding that the discipline is kind of fucked up in a sense that what does that discipline even really mean? And I think to have that kind of discipline, but then to also have a kind of playfulness, I think, I mean, one, I think it makes the work fun, which I think is important. Right, Wes?
It's always got to be fun. Architecture is the most optimistic practice out there, if only because of the resources it consumes and the amount of effort you have to put into it to come up with something in the end. But then on the other side, the discipline itself comes a little bit from the sense of responsibility you have to the public nature of that architectural act, which when it gets turned into art, as you guys were doing, kind of gets shed a little bit, which allows for that playfulness. You guys were able to free yourself up to a level of chance and playfulness that you would never dream of trying to do in a building that people were going to occupy and that had to last for a while or satisfy certain, you know, programmatic requirements or whatever.
Somebody else was paying for it.
Or that somebody else is paying for it, right. So I hope that it would be interesting to see at that level then going forward how this experience might actually begin to influence your practice, whether it relaxes you a little bit, it gives you a sense of what things you might be able to be freer with, or what things you have to be, you still have to hold the line with.
Well, I think that's one of the rationales behind doing this, is that hopefully within the studio, the other designers and people practicing in our office they see me doing this, and they see Mike and the other people associated with doing this, and they do hear us talk about during the design process, like, try this, flip that, you know, mask this, block that, in terms of the early conceptual design, schematic design, and really trying to break out of ruts. Because one of the things I have a concern about in how we're all practicing architecture, those of you who are architects here, which I think is a lot of you, most of us are sitting at a desk, looking into a computer, and most of us are using the same programs. We might be using, you know, for design, we might be using Rhino, you know, ArchiCAD, God knows what, some BIM program. But most of us are looking at the same stuff online. We might be looking at, you know, ArcDaily and stuff like that. I find in my studio, a lot of the younger architects, they're all kind of looking at the same stuff. They're all using the same tools. And I'm seeing a lot of kind of repetition and kind of shortcuts, so to speak, in terms of design vocabulary. And a lot of stuff that looks like, oh, I saw something like that on ArcDaily last week. You know, like it literally, and we have to be careful about that, especially all of us that are practicing or attempting to practice in a way where maybe we're trying to push a language that hopefully is something that's unique and relevant. And I'm really concerned about it. I have a huge concern about it. Yeah, in the back.
You're doing to change the culture in the studio about those shortcuts and using a specific type of software.
Sorry, say that again about the software?
So what are you doing to change the culture within your studio?
Yeah, good question.
To make these younger designers look beyond that.
Well, the first thing I do is complain about it. And then,
So much, right?
then the second thing,
Really like it's the main guy in the studio. You're the one that has the power to change that.
That's right. And one of the things I'm doing is for instance, we've had Mike come in and actually do what we were doing drawing wise. We have our studio do it. We take breaks. We do this kind of thing. Every Thursday afternoon we have what's called Occupy, and they get to take over the studio and do whatever the heck they want to do. And some of the Occupies, they've taken it over and they've done exactly what we were doing and taken it that much farther. And then I'm encouraging them in the design process to come back. Did you learn something there? Applying it. That's the first step. But I think the other step is just a conversation about it and a growing awareness about it. So I think within the profession, just something I'm observing, maybe not as much in academia, but I think within the kind of general architectural profession, I think we're seeing a lot of it.
Well, and I think the book is a good example of an artifact of taking that approach.
Well, it hopefully it demonstrates, particularly within my studio, a commitment to it, right? So you can give lip service. All of us who own architectural firms, we can, within our studio, give lip service to this idea of, look, guys, we got to push the design and the conversation and elevate the general conversation. But then when it gets down to it, it's, we're pressured by budgets and time frames and things like that can constrain the work, just in the reality of practicing. They see this, and I'm talking about internal communication of, I'm serious about it, right? We need to do something, and we're making ongoing commitments in different areas around this.
I would, I guess it's usually my role in these to be the contrarian or whatever, but I would want to remind us of architecture's more historically constant or traditional interest, not in the innovation and originality that seems to obsess our culture nowadays, but in values like excellence or mastery. The presence of the printmaker here represents that as a sort of a technical expertise, but also to say that the conversation is not always one of trying to break out of ruts or whatever, but also there, in my view, is a lot of value in trying to refine what is a rut into something that's more than that, something that may still be very close to the same thing, but rises to a level of quality that takes that rut and turns it into something exemplary. They're just really kind of two sides of the same value, the same appreciation. And to recognize that it's still possible to do good stuff, even if it does feel kind of familiar, And I see in this relationship between these two guys very much the dynamic at play, almost that way, with Robin here representing the side, let's say, of excellence and mastery because he has a practice and because they're starting with projects that have been subject to the reality factor, whether it's economics or structure or client-based program or whatever. And then Mike comes in as the disruptive influence, free of those sorts of things, though he has some experience with Tom Main building Tom's house. Tom himself, in the larger picture, is more of a disruptor than an establishment figure, I guess, even though he's now a Pritzker laureate. And that the book could be seen as a record of that dynamic, both in its positive and potentially even negative sense. So when you held up the book as an example of what could happen there, I immediately started thinking about, it's actually quite a beautiful book as a book. What you were referring to, of course, was all of the images in the book. I was thinking then of the design of the book itself and how um, not crazy, not, purely innovative or original it is, but rather how it demonstrates a certain mastery in terms of the graphic technique and the organization and the logic and how it's put together and all that. And so that also is appreciated in that way. And I think it's important for us to remember both sides of that possibility. We keep both sides keep each other fresh by remembering the other side. So, the interest in excellence maintains a sharpness through an openness to innovation or originality or novelty. But the novelty attains a relevance, a utility, a worthwhileness, only by ultimately taking account of the sense of responsibility that, it has to have as a thing in the world that is going to come into contact with all these other folks and all. So that was just my commercial for the other side a little bit.
Yeah, I think that was. Do you have more?
Well, no, I get the point, and I think that the challenge, people seem to, we have embodied what you're talking about, where we've done a certain body of work, and we've done it again and again, and refined and refined and refined, and I think actually being able to practice architecture effectively and to do a good building, aside from its kind of uniqueness or its that in and of itself is a foundational value that I think we all have to practice from. And I appreciate you saying that, because that for a long time. But at the same time, I struggle with, I go back and forth on this in terms of encouraging my staff, right? And it's the day-to-day, showing up in the office every day and going through. And if you're on a project that lasts for 3 years, you start losing sight of the forest,
Sure.
And so these things hopefully bring a little fresh air into the office, right?
Mm-hmm.
From that. I'm just
Yeah.
talking about the feel of it being
Right.
in the
Yeah.
shop.
No, absolutely.
Well, I think that's. I mean, unless you guys, and if anyone has any questions,
Comments.
the forum is open.
Debates.
Can you talk a little bit about it could be about the emotions, but possibly the actual process of the printmaking and the exploration, like the actual exploration and how that really affected what the outcomes were in the book versus all the pieces? Because there's something like 66 pieces, right?
Yeah, we did 66 pieces in a year. Yep.
And there's a lot that you didn't hit. It's not as if you were only 66 and that's all that came out of the process.
Oh, yeah. Well, want to talk about that, Mike?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about judgment, and there's a lot of conversations in the book about judgment, in terms of the decisions we make, why do we make them, and the kind of the discipline and the kind of playfulness, and I don't know. I don't know. I guess maybe. Francesco, I'm going to maybe put this off to you a little bit, because you see a lot of different processes at the press, and I think maybe you could talk a little bit about the way in which we worked that was different.
Well, I mean, I think there were maybe about 5 plates, all of the five, I think there were 5 or 6 plates, I can't remember. And they were all generated from a series of layered, and I mean, I think there were sets of 3 and 3 or 4 and 4, or maybe I can't quite remember right now, but they were like, I think, fully rendered images that were layered, and each layer became a plate that was basically printed in some of the colors that we were mixing. I think that the first meeting we mix like we mix like maybe 3 or 4 colors, and we were changing the plates and register them accordingly to the original drawing, and so there was a kind of a direction of maybe somehow making a very straightforward print, and that sort of like collapsed into this playfulness in which the registration and the original intention of what it was on the screen or whatever method they used to put it together sort of like collapsed, and Michael and Robin started basically changing the order of the plates. But I think that there was always a kind of a line of maintaining a certain very precise registration. I think on the last half of the project, I was a little bit surprised that in fact, the registration was perfect, so that was actually, it was really good, in midst that there was sort of a certain kind of accidentality in the playfulness, so I think we got a sort of like a full range of permutations, and then on top of that, they were layering down, they were putting moving the paper backwards and forwards, and then blocking the ink, but I think that all of the inks were custom, mixed at the shop, and I think also when Mike mentioned something about the 3-ton mistress, is this big press, which is actually this Mylander press from 1958, and I actually have a particular endearment for it because it is almost like a bicycle, in that it's a press that is mechanized, that it doesn't go way to being this very orthodox printmaking, which would take us to drawing on stone or doing things of a very archaic nature, but it's a press that has an infinite amount of possibilities. So with this project, it sort of like underlined the dynamic of what can be done with that press. So I was very happy.
When as far as like the emotional aspect of printmaking, especially with like a team that was there. There is a kind of dance, almost choreography to it, where Francesco is the kind of master printmaker, knows how to use the machine. I have a certain understanding of printmaking because I've done it for quite a while now with Francesco, and then you also have Robin, who has never printed on that press before and is completely looking at this thing with new eyes, in a certain sense bringing new questions to the table. And so I think there was a wonderful balance, I think, of kind of like the master printmaker, someone who has a sensibility of kind of working through that process, and then you coming to the table and bringing something completely new.
Well, I had to get over the embarrassment of working with a master printmaker, and an architect doesn't know what I'm doing in the shop there, right? It's like, what am I doing in here?
It worked pretty good. It worked really well.
I'm picturing you with artists who know what they're doing, right, and doing proper proofs and this organized, non-emotional kind of production fantasy of mine.
Well, I work with a few people here. Lisa Adams, and she Lee, and Jamie, I guess they're gone. There are a couple of artists that I worked with before.
Anita Bond.
And Anita Bond right here, I work with her. And
She's here, yeah.
and
Ann Diener's here. You did a series of Ann?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, usually architectural, like in architecture, right, you can take photos of certain details of buildings, and like just going through the book, I'm seeing like I guess zoom in shots of portions of the work. I'm just curious on why that specific area rather than like another part of the, and like does that relate to maybe like details of architecture?
I think it just looked cool. We liked the shape. Yeah. There was a certain element of you're pulling all this data and you have to sift through it. That's when Mike talks about judgment. you're looking, there's at some level, it's intuitive, and some pieces and drawings sort of feel right in reference to the project, because we didn't put in the book, by the way, any photos of the project. I argue with Mike about that. I'm thinking, yeah, we need to put in so people know what we're referring to, right? We haven't done any of that, but there is something, so that drove it a little bit, because sometimes a detail might embody the spirit of the project. You might find a piece that at some level resonates for us. That's about as far as I can get to that,
Right. My mind naturally goes to the difference between the artistic detail, which is a small piece of the whole framed. I was doing an article on drawing for another journal at the time, and asked Mike for some pieces of the drawing to use to illustrate it, because it was a article about the difference between, say, hand drawing and computer drawing or sketching, and the potentially alien nature of the dehumanized computer stuff. And I said, can I have some images from the book or whatever? And he was asking, well, what images? And I'm thinking, I don't really care. I just need an example of computer stuff, right? So immediately the question comes up, where do you take that, that sample? Really, it's more like a sample at that point, rather than a detail in that sense.
Yeah.
Although, as Robin says, there are in the field of these things moments that are representative of the whole, that capture the character of the whole. I was actually not looking for that. I was just looking for, random representation of computerish stuff in that. But what I noticed about it that was interesting, that raises this issue of the detail, particularly in relation to their work, is this kind of fractal nature of this stuff, which is to say that you take a small section of one of theirs and blow it up, and it looks just like the big one, and you feel like you could take, particularly with Mike's contribution, which gets in so fine that it just looks like fuzz, like cloud, until you get the magnifying glass out and you see that they're actually little lines, and it's like the Eames's powers of 10. You feel like you could just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And what's interesting about it is that each layer, it looks like the previous layer. So it's like I read recently somebody was saying this about Pollock's paintings, the drip paintings, that, and this is how, frankly, total digression, this is how authenticators now are able to tell the difference between a real Pollock and a fake Pollock, since there are a lot of Pollocks out on the market now. And that is that Pollocks have a fractal dimension that is between 1 and 2 versus the fake Pollocks, in the sense that you can zoom in on a Pollock in several layers, and each layer ends up looking like the overall thing, whereas the fakes, they're not as rich or deep. They don't have the gradation of layers working that way. And so after you go in 1 or 2, it falls apart in a fake. But I think in you guys' work, it doesn't. So the detail becomes representative of the whole in a way that we sometimes like to think of architecture details as doing that. But in their case, it literally is an encapsulation of the whole, rather than an abstraction or anything like that, which is an interesting thing to note. It's almost like classicism in that regard, where in classicism the same design logic and the same figures, the same characters operate from the doorknob up to the scale of a city. The sort of ideas of symmetry and balance and figure and that sort of thing work all the way through. And their art demonstrates that continuity, that self-similarity at all scales too, which is an interesting thing, which I think is kind of unusual for that.
Well, I also wanted to recognize Lino Martinez. He was also a contributed printmaking for part of the project right here in front, master printmaker for series editions.
Lino.
And
Well, thank you, everyone, and purchase yourself a book.
Thanks, guys.
Are you gonna sign them? I think you gotta sign 'em.
Yeah, we're here. We can sign if we get one.
I mean, that's the value of coming to this, right? So you get a signed copy,
Yeah,
not just something off of Amazon or whatever.
Right.